why you think we do these things. Of course, we get fed this idea that it's for freedom and democracy. But what is the real goal? Is it power? Is it money? And who's making the decisions and why?
Well, the decisions in the 1940s, which I discussed, were made in the government and in other planning, private planning circles related to the government, and the implementation of the policies is in the state sector. But remember that the state sector is very closely linked to concentrated private capital, to the corporate sector, industry, in recent years, financial and others, military, it's all energy corporations. They're all a closely linked nexus, and that's essentially where the planning is carried out. And it's not very surprising that the planning is carried out in their interests. That's the way it's always been. So you go back to, say, Adam Smith, when he talked about England, he pointed out correctly that the architects of policy are the people who basically own the country, in his day, merchants and manufacturers. And they make policy to ensure that their own interests are very well served, no matter how grievous the effect on others, including the people of England, I'm virtually quoting. And that's a simple truism, holds for power systems generally, and it's not a great surprise that we're like other power systems.
So let's take Iraq as an example. Who stands to gain from our invasion of Iraq? And is it as simple as saying, hey, a defense contractor will make money, Halliburton will make money, and hence we are going into Iraq because of that? Are there other forces, and what are those forces?
Well, there were very solid reasons for invading Iraq. Iraq has the second largest oil reserves in the world. It's right at the heart of the Middle East region, which is the main energy reserve of the world. Establishing a client regime and a major military base in Iraq and getting preferential access to its resources would be of great value to the people who are our counterparts to Adam Smith's merchants and manufacturers, energy corporations, industrial corporations, banks, and so on. They didn't achieve it. Iraq is an interesting case because it was a defeat. U.S. goals were defeated in Iraq. Very important fact. At the beginning, of course, there were all sorts of pretexts. They're tied up with Al Qaeda. Weapons of mass destruction. When that collapsed, there was a new pretext: we're bringing democracy. In fact, the U.S. fought democracy every step of the way. It tried to prevent elections when couldn't prevent them. It tried to manipulate them and kept going right through to the end. At the very end, say by 2008, when it was pretty clear that the U.S. was not going to achieve its goals, the Bush administration, started talking pretty frankly about what they were. So November 2007, January 2008, there were strong, significant declarations by the administration in which they discussed what the outcome must be. They were not then talking about a status of forces agreement, what it must include. And at that time, they were demanding that what it must include is the U.S. right to use military bases in Iraq indefinitely as a base for combat and other operations, and privileged access to Iraqi energy resources for U.S. corporations. At that point, it was said very explicitly because they were getting desperate. Well, they didn't get either of those. The United States has not been able to suppress Iraqi nationalism. The U.S. could kill any number of insurgents. That wasn't a big problem. But what they couldn't deal with is the mass popular nonviolent resistance. And the U.S. had to back down step by step. That's why the books on Iraq by the most serious analysts, people like Jonathan Steele, David Gardner of the Financial Times, and others, these have titles like Defeat. The U.S. was defeated. But it's clear what the war aims are, and they were sensible aims.
And Of course, they're sensible because a lot of people get confused. They're sensible if you look at it in terms of the companies that are involved. When you and that was a realization I made far, far too late. I never could understand why we wanted the oil when we don't get the oil, and of course,
it doesn't matter.
Right, the American people
don't
get
look,
the oil.
In the 1950s, the U.S. was the major producer and exporter. I mean, but nevertheless, the U.S. was dedicated. The Eisenhower administration was dedicated to controlling the Middle East oil, for the reasons I mentioned. Top planners recognized that if we control Middle East oil, we can control the world. If you have your hand on the spigot, you can control what other people do, whether we use it or not. In fact, the Eisenhower administration, in order to, for the benefit of Texas oil producers, insisted on exhausting our domestic reserves, using up our domestic reserves, and instead of purchasing much cheaper Middle East Saudi oil. Well, those were short-term calculations of profit, but in general, policy is not made for the benefit of the population. Rarely. I mean, in the United States or anywhere else.